of approach to politics and comparative politics. Thank you, Professor Giannetti. You have the floor.
Me, and I send you greetings from me to you and to the people who are attending these conferences. So the topic is populism, a word that speaks of a phenomenon very important in European politics nowadays. And we will try to have a look at what populism means. So I will deal with several issues in this topic. Feel free to interrupt me if there's something you would like. Maybe I deepen in my talk. If you go to my slides, I can show you the outline of my talk. So the first slide, okay, thank you. If you move on, thanks. Okay, here we have examples of populist leaders across the world. But if you go to the following slides, that's the outline of the talk. So first, I will deal with conceptual issues, as populism is a multidimensional, multifaceted phenomenon, and so has been conceptualized and interpreted in different ways. So we go through this different conceptualization and interpretation. Then I will talk about measuring populism, because as political scientists, we are looking for empirical indicators to classify and distinguish political parties that we can define as populist, distinguishing them from those who are not. And finally, I will briefly talk about causes and consequences of the rise of populist parties. All right, you can move to the following slide. Well, populism has been conceptualized as a policy, as an ideology, as a discursive frame or a style of political communication, as a strategy, and finally as a constitutional project. So prior to the upsurge of populism in Western Europe, the notion was mostly applied to Latin American politics to identify a set of irresponsible macroeconomic policies implemented by governing leaders of parties. A classical episode are Argentina, Perón, and Peru, Alan Garcia. You can move down. Thank you. So in the early 90s, these two American scholars, Dornbusch and Edwards, defined populism as a set of economic policies aimed at redistributing income by implementing policies that violate good economics, including budget constraints and efficiency principle. So the main redistributive mechanism was money creation, and these policies are responsible or unsustainable, often ended up in a disaster and hurt most of the ordinary people they intended to help. If you move to the following slide, we see that Daron Acemoglu and other scholars in 2013 tried to explain why this occurred. I remember that Acemoglu was recently awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. So they say that high levels of inequality and weak political institutions determine the emergence of populist leaders and parties that implement policies that are typically to the left of the median voter, meaning left-wing policies. And why this occur? Just a sec. Well, because politicians seeking to be re-elected want to signal voters that they are far away from economic corrupted elites, and so they signal to the electorate this by implementing policies that are that rely on deficit financing, generalized control, and disregard for basic economic equilibria. And in the end, also Acemoglu and colleagues conclude that these policies almost unavoidably result in major macroeconomic crises that end up hurting the people, the poorer segments of society. But obviously, economic populism is not just a phenomenon of Latin American politics. If you move on, it's not only Latin America, because for a long time, this notion was associated with leaders in Latin American countries, but although the term comes to the United States, in particular that the People Party at the end of the 19th century. In the past few years, this word has been applied to Western Europe, and of course also to the United States after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and to the presidency of the United States, but also a country as diverse as Italy, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and of course also the United Kingdom when the UKIP party and the Brexit outcome that everybody knows. The main difference is that while the vast majority of populists in Latin America were left-wing, many of these European populists are right-wing. So we will discuss later the connection between populism and ideology. You can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the research about the phenomenon in Western Europe is so fast growing, it's a huge literature, that somebody say that probably this word has become a zeitgeisty one-word explanation for everything. This is actually not true, because I think that they capture a relevant phenomenon, and it's not just a zeitgeisty word. And probably the use of this zeitgeist comes from the article of Casmude, if you move to the next slide, because Casmude, in an article in 2004, that was whose title was "The Populist Zeitgeist," argued that populism is not an ideology like socialism or liberalism, but it is something that he called a teen ideology, made up of just a few core beliefs. These beliefs are the following two. The first one is that in a society, there's an antagonism between the people, understood as fundamentally good, and the elite, understood as fundamentally corrupt. The second core tenet is that politics should express a general will, a set of desires presumed to be shared as common sense by all ordinary people. So that is a fundamental dualism that we can talk about people-centrism. People can be obviously interpreted in several ways, and this leaves room for populist parties on the left and on the right, and anti-elitism. These, according to Casmude, are the two fundamental features that define populism, and this has been called the ideational approach. And because of its simplicity, we can consider this the predominant approach, as we will see when we move to the issue of measuring populism. However, this is not the only definition in the landscape, and so you can move to the following slide where we see other conceptualization. If you move on. Can you move to the following? Okay. So many people, also people that work in the field of communication, interpret the populism more than a teen ideology as a style or a discursive frame. So a mode to talk about politics. And this approach comes from a philosopher that was Ernesto Laclau, who built on a more general theory that he established with his partner Chantal Mouffe. And there's a basic epistemological contention under this theory and of discourse analysis in general, is that the language is performative, which means that it constitutes social reality, and relational, meaning and social identities are constructed through relation between terms or signifiers. And so in the case of populism, these signifiers are empty, meaning that there's a generic appeal to social justice. If you move on, we will see that according to Laclau, the populism needs an enemy. If you move to the following slide, see, there's no populism without a discursive construction of an enemy. And the second pillar is the structuring of populist discourse around the nodal point of the people. And these people can be interpreted in several ways. Actually, in this view, the people is not monolithic. Populist leaders and parties can appeal to a very diverse group in a society, because the notion of people is constructed and defined different in political, socio-economic, cultural, or historical terms, and it's constantly open to redefinition and contestation, not necessarily anti-pluralist, okay, as in the previous definition. Then, if we move to the following slide, we have also people that have interpreted populism as a political strategy, a mobilization strategy. Like this guy, Wieland, defined populism as a political strategy through which a personalistic leader, so pay attention to the elements of this definition, there's also a personalistic leader seeks or exercises government power based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from larger numbers of mostly unorganized followers. And unfortunately here I put the picture of the assault to Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021, that we hope it never occur again. Then, if you move again onwards, we have another definition. So after the populism as a policy, economic policy, populism as an ideology, although a teen ideology, different from socialism or liberalism. Then we have populism as a style, so a matter of rhetorical communication, then as a mobilization strategy, and finally we have a notion of populism as a constitutional project. So many scholars, and I will talk more extensively about two of them, understand populism as a set of institutional preferences or actual choices against those liberal checks and balances that obstruct the expression of a genuine popular will. In a similar way to what others, like the Italian philosopher Nadia Urbinati, called extreme majoritarianism. Blocher is a contemporary political science, articulates this interpretation, speaking very explicitly of populism as a constitutional project or constitutional populism. A clear precursor of this interpretation, although it's never quoted by anybody, and I don't know why, is William Riker, one of the most important political scientists of the 28th century, okay? So if you move to the following slide, there's the cover of a book written by Riker in 1982, Liberalism Against Populism. And in this book, Riker discusses two views of democracy. The first one is the liberal and Madisonian view that is centered upon checks and balances against the tyranny of the majority, versus a populist interpretation of democracy, what Riker calls populist. And this is the ancestor is the French philosopher Rousseau, which emphasized the popular sovereignty and the will of the majority. Riker was an expert in social choice theory. Social choice theory is a formal theory of group decision making. I have no time now to go into the details of this theory, but it shows rather unequivocally that the populist view of democracy is empty, as there's no will of a majority. Majorities are just an artifact, are crafted by the formal procedure, the voting rules, the skillful manipulation of the politician, the agenda setting processes, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing such a will of the majority. And if you go to the following slide, you will see that Riker, as early as in 1982, wrote, "The 28th century is a populist era worldwide. There's considerable enthusiasm for using cable television to conduct election, but now we would say internet, voting, pushing a button, and thereby the need of any kind of parliament or of legislature, because everybody can vote, directly. As a technology and opportunity combines, such populist proposal will be taken seriously." So for Riker, populism was a huge risk for democracy, and he proposed as an alternative to reinforce those checks and balances, such as institutional checks and balances, such as bicameralism, federalism, independent judiciary, decentralized political parties, and so on and so forth, as a safeguard against this view of direct democracy that when it's taken to the extreme, it is going to subvert the ideal of democracy itself. And surely this is very ironic, a wide dissemination of social choice theory, but Riker said, being a rather arcane theory, this is a task for generations. So if you move to the following slide, Blocher, I think, is very close. Muller and Blocher are the two very close to this Rikerian interpretation, because according to Jan Werner Muller, who is an important political science philosopher, recently wrote an important book about democracy, populism constructs the people as one, and only popular stance is the one that rightfully represents the monolithic nature of society. So populists will act as they had obtained the popular imperative mandate, and as if laws correspond to some established before a general will. Hence, there's no need for the actual ratification of such laws by the people, let alone a recall of representation that might be required after a violation of the imperative mandate. So basically, according to Muller, one feature of populism is anti-parliamentarianism, as we have already seen before. And the second one is this monolithic view of society. So cannot be such thing as a legitimate opposition. So according to Muller, populism is fundamentally anti-pluralist. And this is a cause of the recent upsurge of populism in Western Europe, in the Euro crisis that started, of course, in 2008, and then there was a migration crisis and so on and so forth. But that is something I will talk later a little bit. Muller identifies a pivotal actor that shares the stage with populism, which is technocracy. And in his word, the two mirror each other. Technocracy holds that there's only one correct policy solution. Populism claims that there's only one authentic will of the people aiming at the common good. So if you move on, we can see what else we can say about this interpretation of populism as a constitutional project. This was articulated by Paul Blocher, that focuses on what he calls constitutional populism. Endorses a program that promises to reduce the distance between ordinary citizens and the institution, but so claiming that to directly represent the people and to overcome the constraints to popular rule that they observe in liberal or legal constitutionalism, constraints that are related to the entrenchment of norms, judicial independence, and the closer nature of the legal system. So while populism draws on democratic principle, by drawing extreme one-sided conclusion, it violates key dimensions of constitutionalism, correctly understood, because of course, I have lost the slide, okay, because of course the key dimension of democratic constitutionalism are those of pluralism, inclusiveness, and actual civic participation of citizens. You can move to the following one. Thank you. And so, to summarize, as the only subject that the self-representation is a unified people, which is equated with the majority, there's no need for a higher law that mediates between and integrates different social forces that compete for political power. So you see that is very close, this definition, to the Jan Werner Müller and to the Riker one. But the interesting conclusion is at the end of this slide, because the blocker says that a tendency to embed the populist party itself into the state institution by means of entrenching the political power of the populist in the name of the promotion of the real people and against divisive forces. So anti-pluralism again, quoting Hungary and Poland as examples. And we have seen very clearly that populist leaders, when they are in power, quite often try to modify it very slowly, not in a very, democracy is not collapsing, as in the past, but very slowly eroding democratic institution and entrenching their own party and themselves into power. Okay, so let's go on and go to the following slide. And we move to this measurement issue. So to summarize what I said until now, there are different interpretations, and as you probably have understood, I think that the constitutional one captures a very important dimension of populism. So that's why I stress that in particular. I'm not denying that the other are, of course, as I said at the beginning, it's a multifaceted phenomenon. So all of these facets capture something. But I think that's very important when you want to distinguish empirically, as a political scientist, want to do what are the populist parties from what they are not populist parties or leaders, to have in mind that this view of democracy, to this view of distorted view of democracy is very important to make these distinctions. And to give the word populism a proper analytical utility, as the guy that I quoted before said, if it becomes a word that explains everything, it's not very useful. But if we focus on this constitutional dimension, I think that we have a very precise and more clear definition that helps us in the task of distinguishing parties that are populist from those who are not. So when we come to measurement issues, the basic question that political scientists have asked is the following: how can party values be measured in a consistent, valid, and reliable way, facilitating the identification of populist parties in countries worldwide? And we have different methodological approach, of course. So we have content analysis of party documents, both hand-coded but also computerized text analysis. That's very popular at the moment, or also using expert survey data. So when people attempt to classify populist parties worldwide, they prevailing use or rely on this ideational approach by Kasmude, because, as I say, this is more simple than the other. But we will see that there's at least one attempt, by some scholars from the Netherlands, who tries to capture also this constitutional dimension. So, although Pippa Norris, who was the famous scholar on American democracy, uses a scale that measures populist versus pluralist rhetoric in combination with ideology, meaning what are the policy positions of political parties on policy issues such as the economy, immigration, and so on and so forth. So if you move to the following slide, we have here different ways. The first one is two important data sets that we can use at the moment. One is Populist by Rodwin and all the other authors that you see listed in the slide. The other is called POPPA, and this the acronym of, as we will see, is Populism and Political Parties is an acronym. And then we have a global party survey by Pippa Norris, and then there's another strand of literature that aims to provide a populism score through content analysis of party manifesto or other political documents. And this is typically done by constructing a dictionary and then doing a qualitative or quantitative analysis of party documents to identify populist party according to a specific score. Then there's also expert survey like the Chapel Hill one that include a question about populism. What are expert survey? Well, typically people ask, those who run the expert survey ask experts in several countries to what's their opinion about party policy position. And recently the Chapel Hill, which is the most popular expert survey we can rely on, asked also a question about populism, which is, according to you, what are the populist parties in your country, and so on and so forth. Okay, now we go to the following slide, because I want to talk a bit more extensively about populist and POPPA. So Populist is a database of populist far left, including far left and far right parties in 31 European democracies from 1989 to 2022. Expert informed qualitative comparative classification. What does it mean? Well, it's not just a question asked to the expert. They stay with the expert for a while. They interview basically the expert. And from this informed opinion, they derive a classification. It's a dichotomous measure. So a party is classified as populist or not populist. Instead, populism and political parties, which is POPPA, is a database of 250 political parties in 28 European countries. There was a first wave of this expert survey in 2018, and now there's been a second wave in 2022 or 23, I don't remember, but the results were just presented by one of the authors in Bologna last week, by Andrzej Zaslowy. And so they will be soon available to the scientific community. This is a continuous measure, so it tries to ascertain the degree of populism. So it's not a dichotomy, yes or no, but it's a continuous measure. So if you move on to the following slide, I will show you how populism for POPPA is constructed. So for me now it's difficult to read, but this Manichaean, the first part of these several items. So in the end, it's an index, because there are all these items that give a total score. And the first are let's say, based on this ideational approach, because we have a Manichaean vision, but we have also popular will, and so on and so forth. Then we have also some other aspect that people have emphasized, such as the emotional appeal, the simplification of the language. So there's also some rhetorical component here. Then we have some questions about left and right, and so policy, which means that we can have populist parties on the left and on the right. And then finally, we have also some elements related to party organization. So the degree of intra-party democracy, for example. So these are the items, the multiple items that compose the pop-up measure, which is a continuous measure, as I said. It's a scale that goes from 0 to 10. Later, I have prepared an exemplification of these two ways of measuring populist party, what populist is. If you move on. No, well, okay. See, this was just to exemplify how many parties are considered populist at the moment in Europe, ranging from from the UKIP in the UK, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, the FPO in Austria, the Law and Liberty and in Poland, the Fidesz in Hungary, the Northern League or Lega in Italy, the Five Star Movement in Italy, the Swedish Democrats, and so on and so forth. So just to show you that there's a populist party at least in each European country. So if you move on, I focused here my attention just on two countries. One is Italy and the other is Germany, just to show you that the populist and Poppa classify the parties in different ways. But of course, there are also analyses that show that the measures are correlated. But for example, according to populist, Fratelli d'Italia, the party that is now in government in Italy, is considered populist. Then the Lega is populist. Forza Italia is not populist. Five Star is populist, and the other mainstream party, left-wing Democratic Party, Partito Democratico, is not considered populist. So in the other column, you see the Poppa classification. It's not classification at this stage because, as I said, it is a continuous measure. And you can see that, for example, the Lega and the Five Star is considered the most populist party in Italy. At least this is the first wave, 2018, not the second one. Because Professor Zaslove last week in Bologna said that these scores have changed. And so after 5 years, it can be that a party is not as populist as it was, or maybe some other party became populist. In the case of Germany, there's the populist party, you see there's the Link and the Alternative for Deutschland that are considered populist by the populist database, in the populist database. And for Poppa, Alternative for Deutschland is considered the most populist party. Yes, I put also the percentage of vote that I got in the latest European election, for the election of the European Parliament, showing that these parties, in particular Alternative for Deutschland, so was 15% of the vote, so it's not a residual. Is a party that has these parties have significant consensus, and as we shall see in a moment, they have entered government in many European countries, not just remaining in the opposition. If you move on, I will briefly talk about the causes of the rise of populist parties. So I think for the classification, okay, we could talk and talk, was just an idea how people, what research has provided in terms of measurement and classification of populist parties. When we move to the reason that explain the rise, the electoral success, and the enduring consensus of these parties, we have again another literature relatively huge. And on this explanatory side, political science examined mainly the precondition for the formation of populist party. And the attention focuses on two sets of variables, economic versus cultural. If you think that quite often, especially when we talk about far-right populist party, there's this element of nativism, of, authoritarian preferences, law and order, and so on and so forth. So these are so-called cultural reasons. Then we move to economic stances, and we are in the realm of economic policy. So these two sets of variables affect, according to many scholars, the electoral support for populist parties. Cultural has also to do with the issue of immigration that has become a very relevant issue in Europe. And of course, immigration raises a sentiment of hostility. That's a very important element that differentiates a European populist from Latin American that was never against immigrants, while the many populist parties in Europe, the right-wing ones in particular, are have a very extreme stance in terms of anti-immigration policies. Morelli and other scholars, Italian scholars from Bocconi University, have written extensively on this demand and supply of populism. So demand is the voters and supply are the parties. And the demand side involves the fears and the enthusiasm of people to which politicians pander. The supply side lies in the politician claim to be on the side of people and against the elite. Demand and supply meet at a specific point. According to Morelli and others, this specific point where supply and demand meet is short-term protection. So due to growing economic insecurity, and I already mentioned the euro crisis, but we could also add the refugee crisis in Europe in 2015, people demand short-run protection. At the same time, populist parties find their own space in the political landscape, and they build their agenda on the dichotomy people versus elite. This leads to the supply of short-term protection, since long-termism is considered to be in the interest of the elite. This is a very interesting research that Morelli and others have done in several papers, because in a way, short-term protection bring back us to what I said at the beginning, so economic policies. Morelli is an economist, and so his attention is on economic policies. But it's interesting, this emphasis on how fears of the population and on a side, displacement due to globalization, growing economic inequalities, insecurity, also induced by immigration, meet at a certain point in the demand of short-term protection. So if you move on, I will say something about consequences of the rise of populist parties. Well, consequences are widespread because, of course, in Europe, most governments are made by coalition governments. So, and the successful entry of populist parties in national parliaments deeply affected the process of government formation. For example, in Italy, both in 2013 and also in 2018, in terms of inducing centrifugal tendencies in party competition, because quite often these parties tended to enter party competition and to enter successfully party competition by adopting very extreme stances on economic policy or immigration or anti-EU and so on and so forth. These, of course, has also effect in increasing, let's think about the Netherlands, the party fragmentation at the parliamentary level. So this increases the duration of the government formation process. And then this encourages the formation of grand coalition among mainstream parties with different ideological composition, like happened in Germany, but also in Italy, because, for example, in 2013, the populist five-star movement, everybody agrees in considering the five-star a populist party, at least at the time. And so the government that formed in Italy was a grand coalition made by mainstream parties on the left and on the right, because the electoral success of the five-star movement just was a phenomenon that interrupted the dynamic of party, the pattern changed, altered the pattern of party competition that was based on the alternation between the left and right wing coalition. And this also happened, as I said, in Germany. Finally, research examined what happens when populist parties enter government. For example, Italy again in 2018, when a fully fledged populist government between the five-star movement and the League formed. In terms of what happens in terms of economic policies, constitutional policies, altering the constitution, progressively attacking liberal checks and balances. Again, this is a very important aspect. Although many scholars, for example, I quoted Albertazzi and MacDonald, say that when extreme party and populist party tend to adopt a radical position on some relevant policy dimension, salient dimension for the electorate, tended to moderate themselves once in power. So they start as extreme and then progressively tend to moderate themselves. However, there's a lot of literature here. I have to be cursory about the interaction between mainstream parties and the entry of challenger parties. Some of them are populist, some of them are not populist. But however, the two categories often overlap, as it happened, for example, in Italy, but also in other countries. If you move on, I will say something more, and then I think I will conclude quickly. If you move to the end, well, that's impossible to see from here, but however, here there's a table that comes from one of my articles on Italian party competition in Italy in 2018, where at the top of the table you have the vote percentage of the Italian parties, and then you have, according to expert survey data that I ran myself with some other colleagues, you have the policy position of political parties is a 0-20 point scale on several issue dimensions, such as EU authority, economic policy, social liberties, and then we have environment and many others. And you see that the five-star movement, for example, in the Northern League are very high on top as far as some of these dimensions are concerned, and in particularly the attitude against the EU and also against the immigration. They say illegal immigration, but however, is a general stance that sees immigration as a peril for the country. So if you move on, there's also a spatial representation of Italian politics in 2018. that I hope I will be able to explain very quickly. Well, here is a two-dimensional space that is constructed, using factor analyzing the expert survey data. So we have a two-dimension, the economic left-right, and something that was called demarcation. It's the so-called Galtan dimension that includes attitude towards the EU, towards the immigration, but also civil liberties. And so it's a dimension that captures different things. And then we have economic left, right. And so we can see that on this vertical dimension, the 5-star and the League occupy the same position. If you look at the vertical dimension, they are very distant on the economic left-right, because one is more on the right and the other is more on the left. Despite these differences, they were able to form a government. And you make sense of this outcome just if you look at the more complex two-dimensional space, where you see that on some issue, the two are were very close. So it was possible to them to form a coalition government, if we assume, of course, that coalition are the policy distance is something that matters in the formation of coalition governments. So I also have a slide on 2022, but I am, well, that's basically impossible, but from what I remember, is a paper that's forthcoming in one issue of the Southern European Politics and Society. However, I included the bibliographic reference in my slides. Here with us the policy space in 2022. I don't know if you know that in 2022 the elections were won by a coalition composed by the Fratelli d'Italia, a right-wing party, extreme right-wing party, the Lega, that we have seen already previously, but they dropped very much in electoral support, but still part of the right-wing coalition, and the more centrist Forza Italia. So these three parties were able to form a government that is the right-wing government that actually we have in Italy. And so again, here is interesting to look at the policy position of this party, just to see how close they are on different policy dimensions. Because if we do the usual left-right, we don't understand very much of what's going on. If we move to a more complex representation of the policy space, we make many things make sense, because we can see that these parties are very close, for example, on anti-EU. They may differ on some other dimension, which is the cultural one or the economic policy one. And so this complex representation of the policy space is very useful in understanding the outcomes of party competition and the processes of government formation. Obviously, it's very difficult to integrate this kind of data about policy, about ideology, with data about populism. But there's a woman, a Japanese scholar, Junko Kato, who will be in Bologna on next Monday, she will present a new way of integrating data about populism and policies, and see how the two interact. And it's a new method that she has elaborated with a colleague, and I'm very curious to listen to her talk, because I'm sure I will learn how to integrate different kind of data. And she uses this POPA data as far as populist parties are concerned, and the expert survey of Chapelil to detect party policy in about issues such diverse, such immigration, economy, EU integration process, and so on and so forth. So I think we are going to the conclusion. I have a couple of slides that if you want, move on. Well, not this one. That's are the references on Italy that I put for you, but the way forward. There's no expectation that the demand and supply of populist policies and leaders will decrease soon. We will see what will happen November 5, US presidential election. But for those who have followed the electoral campaign, we have seen already populism at its worst. Liberal democracies are facing unprecedented global crises, global challenges, as, for example, not only the economy, but also immigration, geopolitical shifts of power. In Europe, we also have a war. For the first time since the World War II, we have a war between Russia, well, after the aggression of Russia to Ukraine. And on the other hand, we also have an escalation in the Middle East. So a conflict that also doesn't seem to, to be over quite soon. In any case, it will be a conflictual situation that will last. Many people have talked about misinformation and polarization as the main drivers of a phase that they call of democratic decline. As documented by international organizations such as Freedom House or the more academic VUDEM. It's not a rapid collapse, but a process of executive aggrandizement that gradually erodes, as I said before, the basis of liberal democracies. And doesn't seem that the people are aware of these processes. Not particularly, okay? They seem to be rather indifferent. If we look at the voting turnout, we always observe a decrease in participation, and it doesn't seem that people, realize the dangers for the democracy they live in, and which is a privilege in a phase where democratic backsliding is a very popular word. So we could ask ourselves how much these populist parties contributed to this decline of democracy. On the other hand, for concluding with a more positive note, we can also talk about democratic resilience. We have seen many times, also recently, that democracy may also appeal to a better informed public opinion, to grassroots movements that mobilize to defend democratic institution and principle. So this is an open question. It is true that we are facing unprecedented challenges. So I think that I have concluded at this stage, and if you have any question, you can feel free of asking me. But however, if you move to the next, I just thank you for your attention. I hope that I haven't been too long. It's about an hour talk, so I hope that you're still surviving. Do you?
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you everyone who watches this live stream.
All right. Can I talk? Can I say something?
Sure.